Hey, it's John from Tinderbox Arts. So I'm going to talk to you today about oil changes on the Triumph Bonneville, which includes also the other modern classics like the Thruxton and Scrambler. They're all using basically the same engine. So this is going to include a lot of model years. I'm working on a 2010, but all the oil-cooled model years are going to be very similar. So I would like to try to encourage people to do their own work on their motorcycles, not just for the expense, because it's cheaper to do it yourself, but also because it gets you involved in the bike and helps you understand how it works, and you just feel closer to the bike itself when you go to ride. So I think it's a great idea. So if you're a newbie, this video is really meant for you, and I'm going to go over everything you need to know in order to do your own oil change. I keep a book here on all my vehicles. And on this bike, I have all the information I need for servicing it at my fingertips here, and I keep kind of a diary of maintenance that I've done in the past, so I know where I stand on any little thing that could come up. So from this, I know it's time to do an oil change, and it's a good idea to keep a book like this. And I also keep information like capacity of the oil. So in this particular bike, it's about 4 quarts, and different filters that I can use, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it's a good idea to keep information like this handy so you have it. Now I want to talk to you about all the things that you're going to need in order to do an oil change. And it's not too much, but there are some important things to understand here. So let me start with a filter. I'm using this brand right now. I've used other brands before. There's a K&N filter, which is popular. It's a K&N 204. That had a recall at one point, so I stopped using it. But there's probably nothing wrong with it. Triumph makes one, of course, and there's other brands that you can use as well. But you need the filter. You need oil, of course. And this is one point of contention with a lot of different people, and especially newbies try to understand all the different options available that get confused. So let's talk about oil for a second. Now you can see I'm using the Mobil 1 brand. Don't get too hung up on brand, but it's just what's available to me locally. The important things to consider are the viscosity, which we'll talk about. All right, in this case I'm using 10W40. There is a special type of oil for motorcycles, and that's when you have a wet clutch, meaning that the clutch itself is bathed in engine oil. So it is important to use a motorcycle-based oil because there are differences in the way the oil is formulated, and if you use regular automotive oil, it's not going to work well with that clutch. So that's an important thing to consider. There's an API rating. In this case, it's SH. And if you look in your manual, you'll see there's a minimum rating for it, and this is above that, so we're fine. And then the other question is, do you need to use synthetic oil or regular conventional oil? So let's talk about that for a second. Now there are differences between synthetic and conventional oil. Synthetic oil is made with a different type of base oil than conventional, and because of that, it gets into far more than I want to get into in this video, but because of that, synthetic oil maintains its viscosity under more difficult conditions than conventional oil. So if you have additional heat or additional time, synthetic oil is going to hold up its viscosity better than a conventional oil. So the flow is going to be the same or closer to the same as it started versus a conventional oil. A conventional oil will break down sooner and become thinner. So is it necessary to run full synthetic? In a bike like the Bonneville, and on the other modern classics too, where it's oil cooled, I think it is rather important to use full synthetic. You're putting the oil under a whole bunch of strain that you wouldn't otherwise if it were a water cooled bike. So you're really relying on this oil to do not just the lubrication but also the cooling. So if it starts breaking down on you and the viscosity changes, you're putting your engine under more duress than it needs to be. So I do think it's important to use full synthetic if you can afford it and if it's available. So try to get that. As for the viscosity, if you look in the manual, it will tell you based on temperature what you should be using for viscosity. So the ambient temperature that you're running in, like if you live in Alaska or you live in Hawaii or you live in New Jersey or you live in California, you may have different conditions as far as ambient temperatures. In some places you have a winter season, other places you don't. If you're in the middle of a desert somewhere, you may be running 100-degree weather all day, summer long. Other places you may not. So the viscosity really is related to ambient temperature. Now a 10W40 is a pretty kind of a middle of the road sort of choice, and for most people, I would guess 60 or 80% of most people can run 10W40 and be fine. But if you live in an extreme area where there's extreme temperatures, you may need to look into a different rating. So look in your manual. There'll be a chart there to tell you the best viscosity for your area. Now another thing you need is something to put the old oil in when you drain it out. So I'm just using a plastic pan here. I end up draining this into a different container, which I can take to a parts store and get rid of the oil to have recycled. But you need a low pan. This one is, I don't know, 3 or 4 inches tall. Something they can get underneath the bike without too much trouble. So you'll need that. Then you need something to get the old oil filter off. Now here's some examples. There are definitely more. This is kind of a universal style, which is supposed to expand and contract. They don't work very well, honestly. But if you're not sure of the filter size, that's one option. Then you have strap filters, which are supposed to get smaller or bigger depending on what you're wrapping it around. You may be able to use that. Although on the Bonneville, access for something like this is not super easy. The best option, honestly, is something like this, which is basically this gets put on a socket wrench. So that fits in here. So you need a socket wrench, and it's just a big socket is all it is. It's stamped steel. But there are many different sizes, so you need the right size to fit your particular oil filter, and that may be different. On this particular one, I'm using the, I think it's 65 millimeter size. To actually look, yeah, 65 millimeter size, and that fits the filter that I'm using. But other filters may be slightly different, so you need to check that. But you need some method of getting the old filter off. And finally, you're going to need a way to get the oil drain plug loose. In my case, it's a 13 millimeter wrench. I think most of the modern classics are probably the same. There's one last thing you may need, which is a crush washer, which I actually don't have here. I thought I had stock in them, and if I have one, I can't find it at the moment, so I'll have to look again. But the crush washer goes behind the drain plug, and it's made of copper, and it's made to crush a little bit just to get a nice good seal. Can you reuse the old one? You really shouldn't, but yes, people get away with it, and I've done it myself many times when I didn't have one available. So if the old one is not too bad, you'll probably get away with it, but ideally you will get a new crush washer as well. So those are the things you need. Now I'm going to show you where everything is located and how to get everything apart, and then we'll get going on this. All right, I'm going to show you where the drain plug and the oil filter are located, because that seems to be a point of fear for a lot of newbies. So just follow me down here. Here's the top of the engine. Here's the exhaust. Right, and I'm following down here, and I got to get underneath the bike to show you this. So here's the bottom of the exhaust. If we go underneath here, you'll see right here at the very bottom, I'm going to put the wrench right on it. That's your drain plug right there. Get a good shot. There it is. So here's your exhaust coming down. Okay, and here's your drain plug. And your drain plug on any bike is always going to be located at the bottom of the engine, so the oil drains out, obviously. So we'll be putting that 13 millimeter wrench on that and loosening it. And just, I really got to sneak in here to get the camera. Oh, we're just about there. Let me move the light over a little bit. There. So right here is your oil filter, right underneath it. And to loosen that, you'll use that oil filter wrench, or if it's not on too tight, and it really shouldn't be too tight, you can sometimes even do it by hand. But it's located here. Now, I'm going to mention one special thing. The K&N filter has a nut welded on the bottom of the filter, and that can be used to take the filter off. And it's great. It works pretty well. But don't ever use that nut to put the filter on, because that was actually part of the recall of that brand, was that welded on nut here. I think people were using it to put the filter on, and it would actually tear the bottom, and people wouldn't realize it, and it would start to leak. So that was the reason there was that recall. But most filters don't have that nut. Most filters, the entire filter itself is the shape of a nut, and you're going to use that wrench to get it off. But those are your two things. So here's your drain plug, here's your filter, and then I'll back up a little bit just to get oriented, and there's the bottom of the exhaust. All right, it really doesn't matter if you take off the or undo the oil plug or take off the oil filter first. It's 6 to 1, half dozen the other. It really doesn't matter. But I'm going to do the oil filter only because it makes it easier for me anyway, not to get oil all over myself. So basically we're just going to take, let me see, here's my oil filter wrench, and I got this set the right way to loosen, okay? Lefty loosey, righty tighty, don't forget that. And it shouldn't really be that tight. I have the pan ready to move in place because some oil will come out. So I'm just putting this on the filter, trying to look if you can see that. I think that's just in frame. And then I should be able to just turn this a little bit, and you can see it start to turn, okay? This is hard to get on camera, but, and it's going to start leaking. Now I can do the rest by hand. So I get my pan underneath there, and I'm just going to loosen this by hand, and I'll get oil all over me, but that's all right. There we go. All right, so there's just a little bit of oil there. And that will drain out a little bit, but it'll drain pretty quickly. I got to get the oil filter itself out of the way. So here's the oil filter itself, and I'll put that somewhere where it can drain out. And you'll, if I get that out of the way, you'll just see some little drips coming off from time to time, and that'll stop shortly, and then I can just wipe that down with a rag. Now it isn't necessary to put the new filter on right away before I've drained the oil, but for me it's just easier. I think it's less messy this way. So what we're going to do is open up the new filter. It actually had a little plastic cover there. And the first thing I want to check is there should be a rubber O-ring here, or a gasket if you want to call it that. And that should be no rips, no tears, anything like that. And what I want to do is just put a little bit of oil on that so that when I screw this on, it has some lubrication so I don't rip or tear that gasket. So I'm just going to put a little bit of oil on my finger and just spread that on there. Let me get a little more. I mean, I'm not soaking it. I just want to get a little bit of lubrication on there. You can see it's just a little bit shiny now. That way when I screw this thing on, I'm not going to, tear it. And I always check in here, just make sure there's nothing in there. I mean, it's packaged in a factory, anything can happen. So just check that there's nothing unusual here. These threads look good. It all looks good. So I'm ready to put this on now. Let me reposition the camera. All right, I'm gonna try to get this on camera for you. So I got the filter, and I'm just gonna sneak it up in there. Let me see where I'm going here. Stick my head in the way, all right? I can feel the thread start. I'm doing this left-handed too, and I'm a right-handed guy. So I'm just gonna get those threads started, and it should twist nicely like this. I barely have to touch it. All right, now I feel it's snug. Again, I'm doing this left-handed, so I'm gonna give that a few more turns here till it's... Now, even left-handed, that's probably enough. One mistake newbies make is to over-tighten oil filters. Basically, I'm going to get that hand tight, and that was left-handed. Then I'm going to take my oil filter wrench, stick it back on there, and just give it, whoop, I slipped there, sorry. Just give it a little bit more. And that's about it. All right, we're done. Don't over-tighten it. It's going to be fine. So now our new oil filter is installed. I still need to drain the old oil from this bike, and I'll get my pan in here, and let me find my wrench. Here's my 13 millimeter wrench, and this is another thing where newbies tend to over tighten. So when we put this back on, we got to be careful not to over tighten it. But so I'm just going to give it a quick tug like that, and that should be enough. Now it's not going to start leaking oil right away. I have time to get my pan underneath here. But I'm just going to do the rest by hand. And remember, there is a crush washer. I'll show you in a second. So I don't want to lose that in the drain pan. So I'm loosening this, and you'll feel it get to the end. If you're new at this, you may drop it in the pan, but almost there it is. And there comes the oil. So you're going to get some on your hand. It's not the end of the world. All right, so here's the oil drain plug, and if I take that washer off, so here's the plug, right, 13 millimeter, and this crush washer, this one is made of aluminum. Usually they're either copper or aluminum, both are soft metals, and the point is, because it's a soft metal, when you give this little crank at the end, the metal will crush a little bit, But you can only do that so many times where the metal is going to become, swished down and it's not going to crush anymore. So this one I actually probably can get away with reusing, but honestly, you should, invest in getting a new one if you can. You can get, it doesn't have to be a Triumph part. You can go to a Honda dealer and get a set. They're all basically the same. Just make sure the size is correct, but other than that, you're fine. So get a new crush washer if you can, or if you have to reuse the other one, just check it to make sure there's no real burrs or anything like that on there. But this one looks fine. So I'm going to reuse that. So the oil is almost drained out. Let it drain out completely. And then before we do anything else, make sure we put this plug back in. I'll show you that. So here's a drain plug, right? And I'm just going to tighten that by hand. Always put this drain plug in by hand first. You never want to start it with a socket or a wrench or anything because you could strip the threads and then you're in deep doo-doo. So I'm pushing that till it goes to the end. Now here's my 13 millimeter wrench, right? And again, don't over tighten this. So it's still loose now, I'm barely touching it, but now it's snug. And you'll see I'll go another 1/8 of a turn, maybe quarter max. So watch my hand now. That's it. That's it. So don't over tighten this. It's got a crush washer. I've crushed the washer. That's all you need to do. Don't kill it. Here's another little tip. Here's my drained out oil. And you want to look at that when you have it drained like this for any metal particles or shavings. If you have something going on inside the engine and there's metal being deposited in the oil is going to look kind of like a metallic paint almost. It's going to have very fine particles of shiny metal in it that you'll see. And when I drain this into the other container, I'll check the bottom of this container before I wipe it out and just make sure I don't see any metal particles or anything in there. All right, here on the other side of the bike, here's the front, right? Here's their exhaust. Right here is your oil fill. Now, this is the standard Triumph. You may have a slightly different cap to it. This is kind of awkward. I guess the idea was you could use a coin to open it, but Christ, you'd need a hell of a big coin. So I just used the biggest screwdriver I have, and I'm just careful not to strip the slot. But it shouldn't, again, be too tight. You'd see it didn't take much for me to open that up. So I just crack it open with a screwdriver. And then when I open this, you'll see there's a rubber O-ring on the inside there, and that's what seals it. Check that O-ring to make sure it's not damaged in any way. But if it's not, just clean it up, put that aside. And then to fill this, I guess in theory you could just pour the oil directly in there, but you're going to make a mess. So I use a funnel, and it's a long funnel. So I stick that in there and I hold it, and I pour the oil in way up here. So for me, on this engine, it's about 4 quarts. But when you get close, we're going to check it in the sight glass. Now you can't really check it till you've run the engine because it needs to go through and fill up the filter and fill up all the oil passageways, and then you can actually check it. So there is some time involved there. I happen to know how much this bike takes just because I've done this a million times before, but if it's your first time, sneak up on it, get close. If it's a little bit low, it's not the end of the world. You're just going to run this thing in your driveway for a few minutes, let it settle down, and then you can check the sight glass. All right, I'm just about filled up with the oil, but let me show you the sight glass. So here's the oil fill. This is on the right side of the bike. And if you just look down here, if you haven't seen this before, here's the brake pedal, right? And back in here, I don't know if I can get in there, is the oil sight glass. That sight glass, when the oil is correctly filled, should be about half full. So half the sight glass will show oil and half will show nothing. And the bike needs to be on level ground. You can put it on the center stand if you like, but the bike needs to be level basically. So have someone stand on it or put it on the center stand, and then the oil level should be in the middle here. Now I've just filled this and it's way overfilled though. I can see oil all the way up. Well, that's because I haven't run the bike yet. And once I do run the bike, run the engine on, it'll fill the oil filter. That'll use up some oil. It'll fill the oil cooler up here, right? That's your oil cooler up here. And, once that oil gets circulated a little bit, this will drop down and it'll be right about where it should be. But, if you're doing this for the first time, sneak up on it, check it as you go, get close. If you're a little bit low, you just see a little bit of oil on the bottom, add a little more until you get about halfway. Now, what happens if you go over and you screwed up? Well, it's not the end of the world. All you got to do is loosen that drain plug, drain a little bit out, quickly put it back in. So you're going to hold your hand there and make sure the oil's not too hot. All right, let's go over everything. We've got the oil filter back on and tightened up and cleaned up. We've got the oil plug-in tight and cleaned up. We've got the oil fill plug-in. I got all my oil in that I need. And now I want to start it up and just get that oil flowing a little bit. See if I could do this with... I'll hold the camera under my arm here so I can pull the clutch in. All right, I let that run for a couple minutes. Now I got to let that oil seep back into the pan there, and I can check the sight glass and make sure we're good. That's the whole process. It's really not that hard. After you've made sure the level is correct, you just want to double check that there aren't any leaks. You should change your oil annually, if nothing else. So if you don't do a lot of miles in a year, at least change it every year. If you do enough miles, you might be doing this, several times a year. But check your manual. It will tell you the maximum amount of mileage they want you to go between oil changes. Here's one last shot for you. Here's the sight glass, and that's about halfway. You see the oil is a little bit cloudy, and that's normal when you first start it up after an oil change. There's just some air in there. Once that air kind of breathes out, it'll just look like regular oil again, and that will come down to right about halfway. So right there would be fine. But once the air comes out of the oil, you'll see that that'll be just perfect. So that's what you want to see.